Hey everyone, how's it going? Welcome to another Friday Reads. I'm still on break. I did not do anything for Thanksgiving, but I had a great time visiting a couple of friends in Iowa City from last Saturday to Tuesday. We had a great time just hanging out, and on Thanksgiving Day I didn't do much. I just hung around, read, I watched 2 movies, I listened to 2 albums, actually 3 albums, but one of them was a long piece of classical music, and just enjoyed myself, and I really enjoyed that. And now today I am going to get back into pre-recording some Vlogmas videos. I have a lot of Vlogmas videos already recorded and set to upload as the days progress, so you will be seeing those starting, I believe, next Wednesday. I have a couple more that I'm going to record today, and maybe some that I'll record on Saturday and Sunday. But anyway, for Friday Reads, I am going to talk about what I'm reading, obviously. So I will start with one book that I just started to poke back into today, and that is this. This is The Classical Music Lover's Companion to Orchestral Music by Robert Phillip, which is kind of an encyclopedic work that goes over almost the entire classical musical repertoire of orchestral music, so there's not like chamber music or sonatas or anything. It's, symphonies, piano concertos, violin concertos, those sorts of things. And it's a really great volume if you're a classical music lover. Some of the essays in it I think are more interesting than others. Some of them can be a little dull, but some of them are a lot of fun, and it's just nice to read one about the piece you're listening to kind of get the measure of it, get the idea of what's supposed to be going on. And Robert Phillip also often gives you a little bit of background on the pieces, when they were written, and what they're supposed to convey, and occasionally what the composer was going through at the time they were written, which is something that I always find rather interesting. And there are also brief essays introducing each composer overall, which I really like. They're the brief biographical pieces and just a general evaluation of the composer, which I kind of like. And the reason that I poked back into this volume was because while I was visiting with my friends, we watched a concert recording of a performance of Mozart's 23rd Piano Concerto, which is one of my favorite pieces of classical music ever. And that just made me realize that Mozart is my new favorite composer. I have been listening to a lot of Mozart this year, and it's just hit me how much I've been listening to him this year, and how much I've fallen in love with his work this year. I just love him. I think he strikes such a balance between sorrow and joy, between, dissonance and fear and consolation. There's a lot of people say that Mozart's music is light and happy, but what I like to think of it as is actually voluptuous. There's a sensuousness about it, and even the joyous parts of it are always tempered with the possibility of discord occurring, and even the really dark moments are always peppered with the possibility of consolation, which is why I love his work. So I have been reading a little bit about Mozart's music in here. I've been reading about his piano concertos in particular, which I think are my favorite bit of his output after his operas, which aren't in here because they're not really orchestral, they're opera. But I just love him, and so I've been reading about him, and that's been a lot of fun, and listening to him is a delight, of course. So anyway, I've been reading a little bit from that. If this is a book that sounds interesting to you, now it's on your radar. I'm also still chipping away at When the Light of the World Was Subdued, Our Songs Came Through, a Norton Anthology of Native Nations Poetry, edited by Joy Harjo. I don't have much to report on this, but I'm still working on it, so I thought that I would just let you know that I'm still chipping away at it, but there is that. Now to move into some more substantial discussions, I am continuing to make progress on Frederick Douglass, Prophet of Freedom by David Blight, as a buddy read with Peg from the History Shelf, Bill Rutenberg, and Patrice Jones. Now, in terms of the historical narrative, we are knee-deep in the Civil War years, and that is extremely interesting to get Frederick Douglass's perspective on the Union's approach to the Civil War. He was extremely frustrated with how the Union kind of pussyfooted around the issue of slavery for a lot of the early years of the war. He was really frustrated with the way that President Lincoln was willing to kind of make concessions to slaveholders, was willing to continue to return fugitive slaves to their owners, and refused to allow black people to join the military and fight in the war. And it's really interesting reading about Douglas's perspective and his frustration. He had some rather extreme views about the war with the Confederacy, some of which I don't entirely agree with. He saw basically every white Southerner as complicit in slavery, and I can kind of see what he means there, but I feel like there were so many people in the South who never owned slaves and didn't really care about slavery, and were kind of pulled into this huge war, this destructive war, because the slave-holding aristocracy, so to speak, are the ones who had all the power and caused this to happen. And so I don't feel like those people, deserve the ire that Douglas sometimes gave them. Certainly the slaveholders and others, definitely, but the people in the South who maybe didn't support the war and didn't own slaves, I feel like deserve a lot more grace than the slaveholders who were primarily responsible for the whole, secession crisis and the rise of the war. So it's interesting reading about his perspective, even if I sometimes take issue with what he says. But this is continuing to be a great and insightful read. I'm still loving it, and it's a great buddy read. So that's Frederick Douglass. Next, I have another buddy read. I am now halfway through Unquiet by Linn Ullmann, and this is a highly autobiographical novel. I would even go so far as to call it a piece of autofiction. Linn Ullmann never names herself. She never actually names her mother either Liv Ullmann. But she doesn't really give you any reason to think that the protagonist of the novel isn't just her. And certainly, I don't think there's any doubt that the mother and the father she refers to are Liv Ullmann and Ingmar Bergman, just because it's made very obvious by things that they say and stuff that happens in the book. So Linn Ullmann, the author, is the daughter of the actress Liv Ullmann and the film director Ingmar Bergman, and this novel is about her relationship with the two of them. And it is quite interesting. The first two parts of the novel, it's divided into 6 parts, and the first 2 parts were primarily about Linn Ullmann's relationship with her father, and her conversations with him, especially towards the end of his life, were quite interesting. And it seems like that first part was very much an in-depth character study of Ingmar Bergman himself, and an exploration of what he was like as a father, which wasn't much of one. He didn't do much to raise most of his children, it sounds like. He basically left it to the women in his life to do it. But it also explores just his attitude towards life, his personality and such, and that was fascinating, as being myself a big fan of Ingmar Bergman, as is my buddy reader of the book, Jason from Old Blues Chapter and Verse. And then, in the third part of the book now, we are getting a lot more about Linn Ullmann's relationship with her mother, Liv Ullmann, who's a very different person and was treated very differently. So Liv Ullmann was much more closely involved with Linn Ullmann's upbringing, right? Because Ingmar didn't do very much real parenting. And Linn even says that she only ever visited Ingmar Bergman, maybe once or twice a year. So she spent most of her time with her mother, or with babysitters who her mother hired. And it's interesting. I'm really loving the novel. And what's interesting about this part about Linn Ullmann's relationship with her mother is that what I think she portrays very well is that push and pull aspect of the relationship between a parent and a child. Between a parent and a child, especially when the child is a teenager, there's always this dissonance between their affection for each other and the parent's desire to continue to be an individual who isn't completely defined by their caretaking of their child, and the child's desire to, be an individual and not be constantly watched by their parent, overseen by their parent, and to be their own person. And I think this part of the novel is portraying that extremely well. And what it's also showing is the kind of double standard, right? Because like I said, Ingmar her father, didn't do much to raise her, but no one really batted an eye at that. But then Liv, her mother, is often kind of subtly, reprimanded for occasionally not showing the interest that society thinks she should show in her daughter because she's a woman. And, Liv is constantly leaving Linn with babysitters to go off and work. She doesn't spend a lot of time with her because of her work, even when she is able to live at home. So she is something of a distant mother, even though she's much closer than Bergman was. And that's an interesting dynamic as well. And what's interesting, too, is the portrayal of what it's like to be the child of a person who is very famous, someone who has a lot of demands on their time. And that was something that Ingmar Bergman explored in some of his films, even one that Liv Ullmann starred in, which was Autumn Sonata. But anyway, I won't go into that. So there's a lot of interesting stuff, and I think it's a really, really, really good book right now. The first part of it was a little weak. The writing was a little weak, the dialogue was weak, what was happening wasn't all that interesting, but then the second part, it really picked up a lot of steam. So this is turning into a great read. But that also raises another thing that I kind of have realized this year, is that this is the second novel that I have read this year so far, where the beginning of it really wasn't all that good, or at least was rather underwhelming, I'll say. And then it really picked up a lot of steam in its second part. It's divided into 6 parts. The other novel that I'm thinking of that was similar was The Thousand Crimes of Ming by Tom Linn, which is divided into 3 parts. And part 1, I just was really skeptical of it, I wasn't feeling it, and then part 2 began, and suddenly the writing just blossomed, and the characters just blossomed, and it became a really nice read. And so it's interesting that these 2 reading experiences have happened in the same year. And it makes me wonder sometimes whether some fiction writers want to, when they start their novel, they have such a desire to make a good first impression at the beginning of the novel, that desire, that impulse, actually brings out the worst in their writing. But then once they've gotten past that, once they've let go of that, then they stop being so self-conscious about wanting to do a good opening, and their writing ability actually can come out, and the book becomes better as a result. I don't know whether anyone else has had that experience or thinks that sometimes about books, where the intro is actually the worst part and it gets better as it goes along. I feel like there's a lot of talk about how writers spend a lot of time making sure that the opening of the book is really, really good so that it makes a good first impression, but then sometimes there's the sagging middle idea, right, where once you get past the first part, then it declines. And that just hasn't been in my experience this year with these sorts of things. So I don't know if anyone has thoughts on that, but so that's Unquiet. I should finish that in a few days. One of my Vlogmas videos is actually going to be a review of that book once I finish it, so keep an eye out for that if it's a book that sounds interesting to you. And then lastly, another piece I'm going to read this weekend is from the Collected Essays and Poems of Henry David Thoreau. And this weekend I am going to be reading an essay called Love and an essay called Chastity and Sensuality. And they're both very short essays. Together they're about 10 pages. I'm hoping that they're better than A Yankee in Canada. I assume they will be. I think Thoreau is better at sort of nature writing and sort of philosophical musings than he is at travelogues, as A Yankee in Canada was. So I'll be reading that this weekend. So that's my Friday reads. I hope you all enjoyed. Let me know what you're reading, if you've read any of these books or are interested in them. And I will talk to you all later. Bye.